Hello my reptilian friends, I'm Azalea, and today I'm going to be reading some Her Love Like Poison, a visual novel that I have read before, but I wanted to reread through it anyway, as well as record it for the channel, so here we are. All that I can really say about this game is that it's about mushrooms and Yuri, so with that, let's just jump right in. Starting with some violin. Ethel Briggs was trying to play the second movement of Mozart's Violin Sonata No. 21, but she wasn't having much luck. It had been months since she'd last picked up her violin, and the lack of practice had made her rusty. She had played this particular piece numerous times, not for any competitions. She had always been too shy to enter any, despite Miss Manderley's gentle coaxing, but for her own satisfaction. Mozart's Violin Sonata 21 was one of her favorites. Ethel wasn't a huge Mozart aficionado. She didn't like how upbeat most of his pieces were, how frothy, flippant, and inoffensive. On the whole, she thought that Mozart was far too cheerful. Ethel much preferred the quiet, understated melancholy of Beethoven, or Chopin's clean, precise compositions. But there was something special about the Violin Sonata 21. This was one of Mozart's few sonatas in E minor, composed in Paris, shortly after his mother's death. The first part was allegro, and it contained some of that familiar energy which was so distinctly Mozart, but the second was far more moving. This second movement of Mozart's Violin Sonata 21 had a special place in Ethel's heart, maybe because this was one of the first violin pieces she had heard. It was this piece which had inspired her to take up the violin in the first place. Ethel had wanted to be able to play this melancholy piece with her own two hands, to bring this ethereal haunting music into the world of her own volition. For many years, Ethel had attended her violin lessons dutifully, and for a while, she had accomplished her goal. She had performed this piece often enough that her muscle memory could make up for her lack of practice. But, though Ethel knew she had the notes mostly correct wasn't good enough. Ethel's right hand slipped, the bow scraping unpleasantly against the strings, and she winced. She had been at it for some 5 minutes, trying to recreate her past successes, but this was the final straw. What was the point in pursuing this any further? It wasn't as though she was performing this for an audience. She was at home on her own, and this was a blessing. If her parents and 2 younger brothers had been there, Ethel wouldn't have been able to play her once-beloved violin at all. They would have told her to knock it off, apart from Rowan, maybe. Rowan had always been kind. Or maybe he, unlike the other members of Ethel's family, was simply too self-conscious to say what he actually thought. Maybe Rowan looked down on Ethel too, for her strange, lonely, old-fashioned hobbies. Ethel's family didn't really care for classical music. Her father, Jude, liked Iron Maiden, Dio, and Judas Priest, while her mother, Lauren, listened to anything that was trending on TikTok. Manny, meanwhile, listened to loud, shouty music, and Ethel didn't know what Rowan liked because he never told anybody. Rowan was very secretive about his interests, almost furtive. If her family had listened to classical music, however, Ethel knew they would have preferred Mozart to Beethoven and Chopin. Mozart seemed like exactly the sort of person Lauren would have enjoyed chatting with over a pint. Come to think of it, if the Mozart in Amadeus was at all like the real man, Ethel sighed. She was disappointed in herself. She hadn't been playing the violin for very long, but her jaw was aching and her fingers were already beginning to hurt. Gloomily, she set her violin down. Glumly, she looked at it, lying on her bed. Her eyes softened in such a way that she looked rather like an abandoned puppy. Then, feeling rather sad and sorry for herself, she sniffed. She had loved that violin once, but her love had long since dwindled. Everything which had once brought Ethel joy had become grey and faded since Clementine had left her. What did her love for music matter now? Had it ever mattered? Ethel was already 21, and simultaneously, she was only 21. She was in her final year of university. The adult world loomed before her. Rather than welcoming it, however, Ethel found herself shrinking away from her future responsibilities. That was probably why she had dug out her old violin, to play through her favorite piece from her childhood. She had been trying to cling to the past. She simply didn't want to grow up. Ethel sat down on her bed, defeated. Though she supposed it wasn't her bed anymore. It hadn't been for almost 3 years. When Ethel was at university in Durham, Manny slept in what had once been her room. When Ethel came back for the holidays, Manny and Rowan were forced to share a room, something they both resented. "I know it's a tight squeeze," Jude always said. "Try to bear with it. Ethel can't be expected to share with either of you. She's the oldest, and she's a young lady. She needs her space. Don't be so Shirley." Rowan was good-natured enough that he didn't complain about this sleeping arrangement too much, not to Ethel's face at least. But Manny was less so. Manny was only 13, and he hadn't learned how to be tactful yet. Ethel's youngest brother had been in an awful mood all Christmas, a mood which Ethel knew was largely because of her unwanted presence. It had been a relief when her family had left the day prior for Luton Airport, the holiday they'd been looking forward to so much. Now that Manny was no longer skulking around, shooting her nasty glares whenever their paths crossed, Ethel felt like she could finally breathe. Some small part of Ethel wished that she'd accompanied her family. She'd never been to Australia before, and she was curious about it. But another part of her thought she'd made the right move. She didn't want to keep subjecting Manny to her company. She also enjoyed having the house to herself. That meant she could play the violin without having to worry about the sound carrying. And it did carry in her parents' home, since the walls were so thin. Ethel had been looking forward to being on her own. But now that she was on her own, she couldn't even enjoy her newfound freedom. What was wrong with her? Ethel bit the inside of her cheek, weighing up her options. If she couldn't play her violin, she should at least give her thesis a go. The due date to hand the damned thing in was approaching. She only had 2 months left to work on it, but she'd not written a single line of it yet. She couldn't bring herself to. Like the violin, Ethel had lost all interest in her thesis, and in her degree. Ethel had used her thesis as an excuse to get out of going on holiday with her parents. She'd told them she needed to focus on her work, but she'd been doing precious little work all day, and wasting an awful lot of time. Ethel glanced at her violin, which lay discarded on her bed. Then she sighed for the upteenth time that night. How had things come to this? What had happened to make her lose interest in everything which had once delighted her, especially her beloved violin? Unwilling girls might have been coerced into playing instruments by their parents, but this hadn't been the case with Ethel. Ethel had been introduced to the world of classical music quite by chance, after discovering an old CD full of the stuff in a jumble sale for 50 pence. She had been drawn to the old cracked CD because of the smiley lady on the cover, and she hadn't been too interested in the music itself. When she had listened to that CD, however, she had experienced a revelation. The songs had spoken to her. She had been instantly drawn into the world of classical music, and it had all been thanks to Mozart's Violin Sonata, number 21. Ethel had known, after listening to that CD, that her life would never be the same again. Shortly after, she had pleaded with her parents to take her to violin lessons, so that she could just play as well as the smiley lady with the pixie cut on the cover of that CD. Ethel had since lost that life-altering CD. She'd lost many things which were important to her over the years, but she could remember the cover clearly. The woman had been pretty despite her unconventional haircut, decidedly feminine in her blue wrap dress and her dangly earrings. She had held her violin against the nook of her neck, and in her other hand she had wielded a bow. There had been something commanding about the nameless woman in blue, despite how skinny she had been, how slender her arms and legs. To the young Ethel, she had seemed less like a person and more a queen from a fairy tale, the garland of flowers on her head only adding to this illusion. Ethel hadn't necessarily wanted to play the violin for the sake of it. She had just wanted to look like the nameless lady on the album's cover, a lady who, Ethel now realized, probably hadn't played any of the songs arranged on that CD. The woman on that cover had probably been a model, brought into a studio to pose with a violin she couldn't play. That, or she had been a stock image lifted from the internet. When Ethel had grown up enough to realize this, it had sullied the mystique of that seminal CD, a little like how other children felt betrayed after learning Santa wasn't real. It had been an eye-opening moment, but maybe it had been for the best. This revelation had lessened Ethel's pain, at least, when the CD had gone missing a few years ago. In any case, Ethel's violin lessons had never quite lived up to her expectations. Ethel had kept at the violin, carried by her initial childish enthusiasm, but her enthusiasm had faded when she started secondary school, and she realized that she would never be as smiley or as happy as the elfin woman on that CD cover. She would never be that pretty either. No amount of playing the violin could bring Ethel closer to her idealized image of perfection, something which became all the more apparent when Shania and her gang had started to bully her. Ethel grew so disenchanted with the violin she gave up on her lessons at the start of year 11. She had needed to focus on her GCSEs anyway, and it hadn't helped that she had jammed her fingers during a netball game in PE, and it had hurt for a whole month to hold her bow. Judith never liked when she played in the house anyway, especially when there was a big game on. Manny, meanwhile, had always said her scraping sounded unbearable. "It's like nails on a chalkboard. Can you pack it in?" Manny used to say. And in the end, Ethel did just that. She packed the violin in, but not for good. She continued to play here and there, when her parents and her brothers were out of the house and there was nobody to hear her. Sometimes, Ethel even took joy in her playing, but these moments had been few and far between. Once, Ethel had played the violin dedicatedly, once a week at her teacher's, Miss Manderley. Now she played once a month, if that. And she did so furtively, as if it were a shameful secret. Ethel couldn't help but feel embarrassed as she played, as though she were performing an obscene act even more intimate than masturbation. Maybe playing the violin was masturbation, in a sense, because it had only ever brought her pleasure. Nobody in life had cared to listen to her. Nobody except dear old Miss Manderley. She had been encouraging, but what had this brought Ethel? Ethel left her violin on the bed and approached the window. Her footsteps muffled like a cat's quiet padding. Once there, she stood at the sill and glanced out at the garden beyond. It was late at night. The digital clock on her bedside table said it was already 20:30, and the sky was navy blue, the moon ringed by wisps of clouds. There was a bit of a breeze outside, and the darkened silhouettes of the hedgerows were shaking. Ethel's fingers curled around the windowsill. All of a sudden, being inside felt stifling. Ethel had been so caught up in her memories, she worried they would overwhelm her. Newly uneasy, Ethel took an anxious step away from the window. She wasn't sure why, but she had an intense desire to escape. She had to clear the cobwebs from her mind in some way. And what better way to do that than to go for a walk? It might have been late at night. It was too late to go for a wander, really. But she did live in Oxbury. Oxbury was a tiny village, almost minuscule, really, with a nigh on non-existent crime rate. Nothing bad ever happened there. No stabbings ever took place in Oxbury, contrary to the wild claims Americans on the internet like to make about the UK's crime statistics, or any muggings. Ethel would be just fine. Why wouldn't she be? Oxbury was so safe and sterile, it bordered on the boring. Hadn't she always wanted to go on fun adventures when she was a little girl? Adventure was hardly going to come and find her if she remained indoors, steeped in her reminiscences as if she were a teabag. Ethel didn't imagine that anything exciting would happen on her walk, but it would be better than sitting inside and stewing. Ethel padded downstairs, her feet sinking against the cushioned landing, then the cushioned steps of the staircase, and paused by the front door. She eyed her old coat, but ultimately left it be. It was a brown duffel coat, which Ethel had owned since sixth form. The coat had been in active service for 4 long winters, and the passage of time had taken its toll. One of the toggles of the coat was missing. It had snapped clean off, and the brown, furry fabric was worn and threadbare in places, like a beloved teddy which had been cuddled one too many times. Lauren had tutted when Ethel had come home from university, clad in that natty coat, and shaken her head. "You're still wearing that old thing?" she'd asked, her voice incredulous. "I thought you would have bought a new coat by now. You look like you've come straight out of a jumble sale." Ethel knew that her mother hadn't meant this as a compliment. Ethel's mother rarely complimented her appearances, but she had liked it nonetheless. Lauren had often taken Ethel to jumble sales when she was a girl, ostensibly to find some cheap bits and pieces for their newly renovated kitchen, but actually so she could have a natter with her friends. Lauren would stand by Auntie Jeannie and Auntie Mariella's stalls. They weren't real aunties, of course. They were just her mother's friends, while Ethel would wander around by herself, transfixed by all the wares on display. The jumble sale her mother had frequented every weekend had taken place in the car park of the big Sainsbury in Wrexham, and all sorts of people were in attendance. It hadn't just been Auntie Jeanie, who sold old paperbacks which had once belonged to her mother, and Auntie Mariella, who sold soap and candles. There had been other, more interesting vendors with piercings and tattoos. Some of these vendors sold bits of wood whittled into fantastical creatures, self-painted dioramas of forests and fairy tale castles, handmade jewellery set with stones which couldn't have been precious, but which shone regardless, and beaded dream catchers which swayed in the breeze. Their wares made Auntie Jeanie's old paperbacks and Auntie Mariella's soaps and candles look very pedestrian indeed. Ethel had always loved jumble sales, in part because there had been so much stuff to gawp at. They'd been so busy, Ethel had been able to melt into the crowds, completely anonymous. Ethel had quite liked being told she looked like she had come straight from one of those sales, though her mother had been less than impressed. Lauren had told her that her coat made her look mousy, but that was what Ethel preferred. She had never liked standing out. Maybe that was why she'd chosen to venture outdoors at such a late hour. There wouldn't be anybody on the street to spot her. The coat really was too ratty to keep wearing, however. Ethel left it be, reasoning her jacket would be enough. Ethel did grab her father's old torch from his toolbox, however, just in case she needed it. She stuffed it inside a canvas bag, which she slung over her shoulder. Then she stepped out onto the street. She shut the front door behind her, and soon she was enveloped by the shadows. She hoped she would be able to wander the streets uninterrupted. Well, now this is a coincidence. It's been a while. Ethel, isn't it? But her hopes were soon scuppered. There was a man on the other side of the road, a man who looked almost as washed out as Ethel. It was hard to see in the dark, even with the street lamps illuminating the grey, gloomy pavement, but Ethel recognized the man well enough. He must have been in his 50s now, but he'd been younger when Ethel had first met him. 31, 32. She wasn't sure. He had a lined face which spoke of his encroaching age, though it was lined in such a way that traces of the young man he'd once been could still be seen. His jaw was still firm, his nose aquiline, and his eyes were striking. The man had a full head of hair despite his age, and it was more sandy brown than grey, shot through with only a few lighter strands. He wasn't a bad-looking man, he was definitely no monster, but Ethel still shrunk away from him. She knew him, but that did little to endear her to him. This was Mr. Brown, one of Ethel's teachers back in primary school. Mr. Brown had been one of the few male teachers at Oxbury Primary. In fact, he might have been the only male teacher, and he had stood out from the rest, not just because of his gender, but because of his sheer size. He had been a mountain of a man, so much so he had to stoop to enter and exit the classroom. He had been head and shoulders above Mrs. Pierce, Mrs. Spriggett, and Mrs. Moles, quite literally. Ethel had always found Mr. Brown intimidating, what with his sheer vastness, not to mention his voice, which had been deep and booming. Ethel, granted, had been a good deal shorter herself back when she had been in primary school, but Mr. Brown didn't look any less intimidating over a decade later. Ethel had grown while Mr. Brown had not, but he still eclipsed her. Mr. Brown was taller than Rowan, who had shot up when he started secondary school. Taller, too, than her father, who had played basketball when he was younger. He was easily taller than 6 feet. He could even have been pushing 7. Mr. Brown was a vast mountain of a man with large hands and large feet, whose coat seemed too small to contain him. Ethel had been afraid of Mr. Brown as a young girl, and little had changed. But she was still afraid of him. Ethel shrunk back, shaking. What was Mr. Brown doing outside so very late? It was strange, but... Ah, that explained it. He must have been walking his dog. Mr. Brown's dog was a curious sight. It was the polar opposite of its owner, small and runty, where Mr. Brown was tall and wide. The dog and the owner were so mismatched, it was almost comical. The diminutive dog, was he a spaniel? Ethel wasn't sure. Was so tiny, Ethel worried Mr. Brown might step on it by accident. Ethel hadn't known that Mr. Brown had a dog. She didn't know much about Mr. Brown at all. She hadn't thought about him in years. Was the spaniel? Yes, Ethel was sure that it was a spaniel, a new addition to his family. Well, whatever. It didn't really matter. Ethel? Ethel's shocked silence must have perturbed Mr. Brown, because he sounded concerned when he said, "You are Ethel, aren't you? Ethel Briggs? It's been a while since I saw you, but I remember you. I don't forget any of my students." Yes, I'm Ethel. I'm sorry? I thought as much. It's nice to know I'm not going completely senile. I take it you're back home from university then?
Yes.
You're going to Durham?
Yes. Did my parents tell you that?
Aye, they did. Jude told me.
Oh, do you see my parents very much then?
Oh, aye. We go to the pub quiz together sometimes, in Wrexham. Your father can be very competitive.
Ethel didn't disbelieve that.
Jude had always been a bit of a know-it-all.
He was the sort of man who liked to watch quiz shows solely so he could yell at the contestants for getting things wrong. And woe betide they loused up any questions on classic rock. That was Jude's specialty. Ethel couldn't imagine her mother joining in a pub quiz all that enthusiastically. But she probably went along for the drinks and the peanuts. Ethel had been to the pub in Wrexham with her parents a couple of times, and Lauren got on rather well with the proprietor, old Jerry. He always made a show of IDing Lauren whenever she ordered a pint, though it wasn't really necessary. Lauren might have been young for a mother of 3, and she took great pains to ensure her makeup was just so. But she was in her early 42. It was impossible that anybody might mistake her for a teenager, but Lauren still liked the attention. She thrived on it.
I've been seeing quite a bit of your parents, actually. After Evie's funeral, your mum helped me with the arrangements, and with all of the refreshments. Her help was invaluable.
Ah, now that sounded familiar. Ethel thought her mother might have mentioned, at some point or another, that her old primary school teacher's wife had died recently. She hadn't given it much thought, but she supposed her mother must have been talking about Mr. Brown. He was the only male teacher she'd had, and Ethel didn't think that Miss Pierce, Mrs. Spriggett, or Mrs. Moles had been having any clandestine lesbian affairs on the sly. They were all too old-fashioned. Ethel wondered, briefly, if Mr. Brown expected her to comment on his wife's passing, but she was spared the need when he continued once more, readjusting his grip on his dog's lead.
I've been curious about you too. You were one of my better students, even among all the Year 5 kiddos, so I ask about you sometimes. I hope you don't mind?
Ethel did mind, as it happened. She didn't like being spoken about behind her back, even if the talk was all positive. She didn't know how to articulate this, however, without sounding rude. Stuck for words, Ethel looked at her feet and said, "Oh, no, it's fine."
Her parents are quite proud of you, you know. They can't stop boasting about you.
Ethel thought this was highly unlikely. She might have gotten into a good university, and maybe she was doing well academically, but her parents had never placed much stock into highfalutin things like degrees. Neither of her parents had been to university. Jude had joined the workforce as soon as he'd been able. He'd apprenticed as a plumber, and Lauren hadn't even finished secondary school. She had packed in school altogether when she'd been 15, so she could pursue her dreams of superstardom. Unfortunately for Lauren, however, these dreams hadn't come into fruition. She had done some modeling for trashy tabloids for a few years, before debuting as an actress in a few sleazy low-budget flicks Ethel had never wanted to see. Lauren had wound up settling down and starting a family with Jude when she was only 21. Her age, Ethel thought with a shiver, though she'd never seemed particularly bitter about her lot in life. Lauren had never taken much of an interest in her daughter's creative or academic pursuits, though she'd not been dismissive of them either. Lauren had driven Ethel all the way to Wrexham once a week for her violin lessons with Miss Manderley, lessons she had paid for without complaining. She had seemed pleased too, when Ethel had been accepted into a university of choice, though her pleasure hadn't been much more effusive than a benign, "Oh, that's nice, dear. I suppose we'll have to get your student grant sorted out then, eh?" Ethel found it hard to believe that her mother had been boasting about her academically talented daughter. Lauren would have been more inclined to boast if Ethel had started to dress more fashionably, or if she'd learned how to apply eyeliner without making her eyes water, or if she'd started her own successful TikTok channel. Lauren had a TikTok account of her own, where she filmed herself putting on makeup, taking off makeup, showing off her nails, and singing along to her favourite pop songs. Lauren was actually fairly successful on the platform, and she had managed to rack up over 300,000 followers in the span of 2 years. She sometimes did sponsorships with makeup brands, and it was her newfound fame which had paid for Manny's fancy gaming PC, Jude's new guitar, and the family holiday in Australia. If Ethel had been like Lauren, bouncy and cheerful, Ethel imagined her mother might have been more inclined to boast about her. But as it was, Ethel thought it was doubtful. It wasn't hard to imagine that Mr. Brown cared about Ethel's academic achievements more than her own parents did. Still, it was kind of him, Ethel supposed, to bother spinning her a white lie like that. He must have been trying to cheer her up.
"Oh, I'm sorry. Where are my manners? You'll be on your Christmas holidays now, won't you? I doubt you'll want to talk about university much right now."
"Oh, not really."
"I thought as much. I'm sorry for bringing it up. I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable."
The thought was appreciated, but Ethel thought it was rather too late for that. She already felt uncomfortable. That wasn't necessarily Mr. Brown's fault, however. She felt uncomfortable about most things in life. That was just how she was.
"I'd leave you on your merry way, but I am curious. What are you doing, going for a walk at this hour?" "It's very dark outside, and I think it might start raining soon. Are you sure you'll be alright?"
"Thank you, but I'll be fine."
"Are you sure?"
Ethel nodded. "I have my phone with me, and I even brought my dad's old torch if it gets too dark. It should be able to light the way, but I won't be gone long. I just wanted to go looking for bats."
"Bats?"
"Yes, and nightjars. My dad took me out to look for them sometimes, when I was little. I know my way around the forest, so it should be fine."
If you say so.
Mr. Brown didn't look wholly reassured, but he didn't try to question Ethel further. Maybe he didn't have the time for it. His dog was beginning to tug on his lead, yipping fiercely as he did. Mr. Brown's dog might have been small, but he had quite the set of lungs on him, and he clearly wasn't afraid of using them.
Ah, it looks like his lordship here is getting hungry. I can't keep him waiting, not if I don't want him to wake up half the blasted village. I should be off now, but do take care of yourself. I know you're a great grown lass by now, but the woods can be perilous at night. Even if you have a torch and you know your way, the woods are a lot bigger than they look. I wouldn't want you getting lost, and you know what happened to the Delaney girl, don't you?
Well, of course Ethel knew what had happened to that Delaney girl. Everybody in Oxbury did. It had been quite the topic of conversation when it had happened. Ethel hadn't been living in Oxbury then. She'd just started university in Durham, and she'd been trying desperately to keep her head above the water, but Lauren had told her all about it. Her mother had called her, breathless, to tell her that a girl had gone missing. And it wouldn't be the first time either. Don't you remember that Chloe girl? We were still in primary school at the time, but that caused such a stir too. I wonder if the cases are related. Ethel hadn't liked the way her mother had talked about the girl's disappearance, as though it was some amusing piece of gossip, no different from who was dating who on Love Island. She had found it rather tasteless. Ethel hadn't known the missing girl. She'd not been a local of Oxbury. According to the local paper, she'd been staying there for a few days, with a couple of relatives, and she didn't remember her first name. She thought it had been something unusual, though. Something exotic. India, maybe. Indigo. Well, in any case, the girl had last been sighted near the edge of the woods by a dog walker. The police had combed every inch of the forest, but her body had never been discovered, if there was a body to uncover at all. It was possible she had grown bored of being stuck in Oxbury, and she had run away. There was no guarantee she had come to a sticky end, and neither was there any evidence. But Ethel still wondered. And so, it seemed, did Mr. Brown. It had been almost 3 years since the young Miss Delaney's disappearance, but it had cast something of a pall over Oxbury. As a teacher, Mr. Brown must have been more concerned than most. He had spent the better part of his life looking after small children, cleaning skinned knees and breaking up arguments over who stole whose favorite toy. Ethel could hardly fault Mr. Brown for worrying, but his concern still rankled. There was something uncomfortably cloying about it. Did Mr. Brown still regard her as a child? Was that why he was lecturing her? Ethel was 21 now. She knew Mr. Brown would never regard her as an adult in her own right. How could he, when he'd known her as a 9-year-old? This realization was an uncomfortable one. It made Ethel cringe. I'll be fine, really. I know my way around, and I have my phone. If I do get lost, I can call for help. Who Ethel would call if she got lost exactly was a mystery even to her. She could hardly call her parents, given they were in Australia, and she knew she wouldn't have the courage to call the police. Ethel would have hesitated to dial 999, even if her home had been broken into by a couple of machete-wielding muggers. She wouldn't have wanted to be a burden. Maybe Mr. Brown realized this. He had known Ethel for several years, but he chose, rather tactfully, not to comment upon it. Instead, he nodded and said, "Very good. Take care then. And make sure you come back before it rains, eh?" "Thank you. I'll, see you later?" "I'm sure you will. If you need anything while your parents are away, remember, Sparky and I are just a few doors down." Sparky? Was that the name of Mr. Brown's dog? Ethel supposed it must have been. Though what a small dog like Sparky could possibly do to help her, or anybody for that matter, was a mystery. Ethel doubted she would have cause to call on Mr. Brown, or on Sparky, during the ensuing days, but she didn't say this. Instead, she nodded, and thanked Mr. Brown, who smiled in return. "Good night then, Ethel. I hope you have luck finding your bats." "I hope so too." Ethel hadn't had much luck during the last few months, not since the start of her third and final year at university. She could have used a bit of good fortune. Mr. Brown gave Ethel a brief wave with the hand which wasn't occupied with Sparky's leash, and turned. Mr. Brown's footsteps faded away, as did the sound of Sparky's indignant yapping, though this took far longer to fade. For such a small dog, Sparky was awfully loud. Ethel watched for a few moments, motionless. Then she spun on her heels. It was time to go to the forest. Ethel began to walk through the village once more, picking her way through the latticework of shadows which were slowly lengthening on the ground. The footfalls were dull on the pavement, a series of muted sounds which offered little competition when contrasted with the mournful moaning of the wind. It had been breezy when Ethel first stepped outdoors, but the wind was beginning to pick up now. It tugged at her braids, and she shivered. She should have expected the poor weather, given it was very early January, but she was still surprised by just how frigid it was. What was the temperature? It must have been in the single digits. Ethel looked up at the sky which hung above her, dark and mysterious. The clouds were grim, foreboding even, but they didn't look numerous enough to promise rain. Maybe Mr. Brown had been wrong about the weather. But Mr. Brown was a sensible man, and it seemed unlikely he would make a mistake, even, or perhaps especially, about something as mundane as the weather. She would have to be quick about her walk if she didn't want to get drenched. She would step into the woods and make a neat circuit about the trees. Then, after 15 minutes, she would head back. Yes, that would be fine. She wouldn't wander too far. What was the point? It wasn't like Oxbury's forest was all that exciting either. It was in a dreamlike manner that Ethel navigated the streets. As she did, the wind blew. It sounded sad, like a wounded animal. Maybe coming out here was a mistake after all. What was the point in coming all the way out here anyway? There was nothing that Ethel really wanted to do in the woods. She was just trying to run away from the responsibilities, like she had with Clementine. But Ethel didn't want to think about that. It was with uncertain eyes that Ethel glanced about the dense woodland which surrounded her. In the distance, somewhere far above her head, an owl hooted. The sound split the air quite suddenly, and Ethel jumped. She hadn't expected it. She could feel her pulse hammering uncomfortably in the base of her neck. Ethel had been into the forest many times before, sometimes with her parents, and sometimes with her brothers, though more often than not on her own, but it felt different tonight. Maybe it was because of Mr. Brown's warning. That Delaney girl was on Ethel's mind. It felt almost as if she were watching her from the shadows, giggling at Ethel's unease. There was something disconcerting about the woods tonight. Something devouring. It seemed almost to be inviting her in, but beneath its cordiality, there lurked something uncompromising. When Ethel closed her eyes, she thought she could even hear strange whispers upon the breeze. But surely that was silly. Nothing lived in the forest apart from rabbits, mice, and the odd badger. There was nothing waiting in the woods for her. She was being stupid. Ethel took a deep breath. Then she stepped forwards. The loose leaves strewn on the cold, hard ground crunched beneath her soles, and once again, an owl hooted. This time, however, it didn't startle her. She was prepared for it. Ethel continued to trample through the woods, her father's chunky torch in hand. It wasn't a very reliable source of light. It kept gutting in and out, but at least it had a dual purpose. If push came to shove, and she was set upon by some miscreant, it was heavy enough that she could use it as a weapon. Ethel doubted anybody would attack her, however, despite Mr. Brown's warnings. She was in Oxbury, for goodness sake. It wasn't the sort of place where people were attacked. Hell, not even the missing Delaney girl had been attacked. She had simply disappeared. Besides, it wasn't like Ethel had anything on her that was worth stealing. Her phone was an old Samsung, at least 6 generations out of date. So delightfully archaic in the current year that Clementine had laughed at her. She had always joked that Ethel's phone belonged in a museum. Ethel hadn't bothered to bring her wallet with her either. There weren't any shops open this late. There were scarcely any shops in Oxbury at all, save for the corner shop owned by the Lilly family, and that closed at 6 o'clock. 6 had already come, and passed, a long time ago. Now it was almost 9 o'clock, and Ethel could feel it. The wind blew, uncomfortably cold, trailing its invisible fingers against Ethel's cheeks. Mr. Brown had warned that it might rain, but it felt so cold snow was beginning to seem more likely. Though it had been cold for the last month, it hadn't snowed yet. It had been a predictably British sort of a Christmas. Not white, but brown and grey and squaddy. There had been no pure white sheets of incorruptible snow, not even a few token powdery flakes falling from the sky. There had, however, been rain, and plenty of it. Rain which had tipped it down in stair rods on Christmas Eve and Boxing Day. It hadn't rained on Christmas itself, which had been something of a small mercy, but it had been continuously cloudy and overcast throughout the holy day. Ethel hadn't gone outside on Christmas, though her parents and her brothers had. They'd asked if she'd like to take a turn in the woods herself, get some colour into her cheeks, but Ethel had declined these generous invitations. Ethel had thought it would be too muddy, and she hadn't wanted to twist her ankle. Fortunately, it hadn't rained at all in the ensuing week. The forest floor might once have been squelching mud and mire, but now the dirt was reassuredly cold and compact. Ethel was unsure whether that would last for very long, however. Not if it really did begin to rain. The moon overhead was round and full that night, just like a perfect pearl. An earring nestled in the ear of a beautiful woman. Lauren had nagged Ethel to get her own ears pierced, but Ethel had never wanted to go along with it. She'd worried that it would hurt, and anyway, she hadn't really seen the point in it. She didn't understand the appeal of poking holes in herself. Not so she could gussy herself up with the studs and hoops and glinting bits of gold. She had no interest in making herself a target for any thieving magpies. Lauren had always laughed at Ethel's unease. "Don't be so dopey. Heaps of girls even younger than you get their ears pierced. I was only 7 when I had mine done, and it didn't hurt at all." But Ethel had remained firm. She could be stubborn about the strangest of things. Lauren had once been bemused by her daughter's indifference, but she hadn't pushed the issue. Not too much, at least. Instead, Lauren had shrugged and said, "Oh well, suit yourself. You are being daft though, Effie." That was how most of Ethel's conversations with her mother went. She was always calling her daft. Sometimes, Ethel took offense, even though it was a very mild insult, better even than the things kids said on the playground. Sometimes, however, she thought that her mother had a point. She really was daft. She was being daft right now, wandering through the woods so very late at night. But still, she didn't stop. She kept on walking, the foliage crunching underfoot. Sometimes, Ethel liked to imagine that she was a heroine from a romantic poem when she wandered through the woods, a nameless beauty Lord Byron might have committed to the paper, who walked with all the grace of the night itself. But Ethel knew that this was nothing more than a fantasy. She was, in all aspects, hopelessly plain. Maybe that was why Clementine had... No, Ethel wasn't going to think about that. She did have to think about her thesis, however. It was weighing on her. Why, she wondered, had she been silly enough to write her thesis on romantic poets when they focus so intensely, obsessively even, on things which were beautiful? If they weren't waxing poetic on beautiful women, then they were writing of the beauties of nature, of lakes and forests and hills and dizzying high cliffs capped with snow. Sometimes, Ethel liked to read about the beauties of nature. It was rarer that she'd like to read about beautiful women. The former was uplifting, but the latter was just depressing. Was that why she was struggling with her thesis so much? Was it the subject matter? Ethel didn't think that she had lost interest in her poetry, but her enthusiasm had definitely dwindled. Maybe it was inevitable, when Clementine had been the one to pique her interest in the subject. Clementine had always been very passionate about poetry, romantic poetry in particular. Through reading these old poems with Clementine, Ethel had found something in them to appreciate herself, something she had never noticed before. But maybe it wasn't the words of these poems she had appreciated, but the way they sounded in Clementine's mouth when she spoke them. Had Ethel only pretended to be interested in poetry because she had wanted to have more in common with Clementine? In retrospect, that seemed depressingly likely. Ethel had wanted Clementine to like her. She had been almost slavish in the way she had followed her about, laughing at all her jokes a little too loudly, affirming that yes, of course all of her essays were wonderfully original. She had even offered to be Clementine's caddy when they had been on campus. Ethel had been only too happy to buy Clementine drinks from the vending machine or snacks from the student shop whenever she so desired. Ethel had wanted Clementine to like her so badly for such a long time. Then, Clementine had liked her, and it had been wonderful. For over a year, Ethel had been suspended upon the clouds. Nothing could have hurt her, until it all came crashing down. Had that been inevitable? Maybe she should have expected it. Ethel shuddered. She felt very, very cold and uncomfortable alongside it. This coldness did not abate the further Ethel walked into the woods. An icy chill coiled inside her guts, clenched about her heart like a vice. She could feel it too, upon the crown of her head, trickling down her neck. She could feel... Oh, was that rain? It looked like Mr. Brown had been right. The rain came slowly at first, and irregularly, but it didn't take long before spears of the stuff started pelting down. The rain made everything look faint and blurry, as if it was being viewed through a filter. Something in the undergrowth rustled, and Ethel glanced in its direction, the wind whipping her hair about her face. What was that? Ethel knew the answer to that was probably nothing. Or if it wasn't nothing, then it was a small, insignificant sort of something. It must have been a rabbit seeking shelter from the rain. That, or a vole, or maybe a sodden squirrel. There was nothing for Ethel to worry about. Apart from the miserable weather, of course. Ethel shouldn't have ventured so far into the woods, but it was too late to worry about that now. She couldn't double back on herself in hopes of avoiding the rain. Her home was a good half-hour walk away. Ethel had come further than she had meant to, and had fallen, quite literally, off the beaten path. The trees now rose up about her, dark and ominous, like mute watchmen standing sentinel. Ethel looked about worriedly. She had no idea when the rain was going to stop, but she doubted it would be any time soon. She had to take shelter somewhere, but where? What about the church? St. Catherine's was an old, crooked building which bordered the forest. It was located on the fringe of Oxbury, away from the rest of the houses. Ethel's parents weren't religious, but her grandmother was, and she'd taken Ethel to St. Catherine's a few times in the past, mostly for Easter and Christmas services, where they sang hymns praising a god none of them put all that much stock in. Ethel wasn't very religious either. She must have inherited it from her father, just like his freckles. But she did wonder on occasions. The world was governed by some greater power nobody could see. Ethel had even tried praying a few times, as it happened, to see if some mysterious greater power would answer. But she had felt silly and self-conscious, even though she had been on her own, and she'd soon stopped. She hadn't been able to rid herself of the mental image of her father, scoffing as he said, "God? What a load of bollocks. The only god I believe in is Jimi Hendrix." Ethel hadn't been about to pray to Jimi Hendrix, of course, and the mere idea had been so silly it had dampened her momentary religious musings. Ethel still wasn't sure if she believed in God, but if he did exist, she was sure he wouldn't mind if she took shelter in one of his churches for a while. If she could avoid the worst of the rain, then she would have nothing negative to say on the subject of organized religion in the foreseeable future. It wasn't like Ethel had any particular vendetta against Christianity anyway, not like her father, who railed against it as being illogical and impractical. Jude found a lot of things illogical and impractical. Ethel knew that her love for English literature ranked quite highly on his list. Ethel bit her lip. Then she began to pick her way through the forest. The rain was coming down even harder now, thick and fast and unforgiving, and it obscured her vision. It didn't help that it was so dark either. The light from Jude's old torch wasn't doing much to help. It was hard for Ethel to keep her footing. The floor was mulchy, and it was fastened with roots, arched raised things which threatened to trip Ethel at every step. Ethel sidestepped a thorn bush, and very nearly walked smack dab into a tree, though she was able to circumnavigate it just in time. That had been a close call. As little as Ethel enjoyed being rained on, she enjoyed the thought of breaking a limb even less. Ethel continued to walk, picking up speed as she did. The church wasn't so far away now. She would be able to duck inside and dry herself off, provided, of course, that the door was unlocked. She broke through the last line of trees, her clothes sticking to her skin like tarpaulin, and looked up at St. Catherine's. The church was small and squat, but it did look oddly imposing in the dark, its tiled roof superimposed against the wickedly thin crescent moon. St. Catherine's arched wooden door loomed over Ethel as she approached it, almost consuming in the darkness. Ethel had been sure she would be able to take shelter here, like the persecuted Esmeralda and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. But maybe not. It wouldn't have been too surprising if the warden had locked the church come sunset. It wouldn't do to have vandals laying waste to its interior, taking off of the burnished bronze candlesticks and the prayer mats. Ethel didn't think there was anything worth nicking in St. Catherine's, but some people would take anything if it wasn't nailed down. It wasn't like there was much else to do in Oxbury, other than look for the potentially decomposing corpse of the presumably dead Delaney girl. But now she had come this far, she felt compelled to try. It would have been foolish to back down now. Ethel paused to wipe her brow free of rainwater. Not that it much mattered, really, given how fiercely the rain was still pouring down. Then she reached for the wooden door of St. Catherine's. She pressed her palm against the door and pushed inwards. She didn't expect the door to give way beneath her touch. She was starting to feel decidedly pessimistic, but Ethel gasped, surprised, as the door cleaved beneath her touch. So, it was open after all. That was reassuring. Ethel pushed against the door with more strength than before, and the door swung inwards. The door was heavy, but it offered little resistance, creaking loudly like some subterranean monster. Ethel could see a sliver of the church through the gap which emerged, and she could see it was dark. This, however, was to be expected. It was very late at night. It seemed unlikely that there would be anybody else there at such an hour. She would have been alarmed, in fact, if there was. It came as a great surprise, therefore, when Ethel finally slipped inside the building, and she saw her. There was a girl standing in the chancel, framed by the stained glass window. Okay, and I think that is a good point to stop for this session. I don't know how often I'm going to be uploading these readings. At minimum, it's going to be once a week, but I do want to try for 3 or 4 times a week. I'll just have to see how that goes. Just keep an eye on the channel. I'm going to be sure to upload these videos at the same time every day. Not sure what time that is yet. Whatever time this video was uploaded is going to be the same time as all future videos. Give or take. Might be a difference of maybe an hour or so, but it shouldn't deviate too much. Anyway, that'll be all for today. I'll catch you all next time. Bye-bye.